Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, President Trump vents frustration at the pace of the Ukraine ceasefire talks, saying that he's, quote, disappointed and very angry with President Putin. We ask, why? The Kremlin responds, saying that the effort to end the three-year-long war in Ukraine is, quote, a drawn-out process, but those efforts are ongoing. And France's far-right party leader, Marine Le Pen, is found guilty of embezzling EU funds. We ask, what does this mean for her ambition to run for the presidency in 2027? Hello, and thank you very much indeed for joining us. The US President Donald Trump says he is disappointed and very angry with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. This after weeks of attempting to negotiate a ceasefire deal for Ukraine. While aboard Air Force One, President Trump criticized President Putin for attacking the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's credibility. Well, President Trump went on to threaten to impose a 50% tariff on countries buying Russian oil. That's if Moscow doesn't agree to a ceasefire.
I don't think he's going to go back on his word. You're talking about Putin. And I was disappointed in a certain way, some of the things that were said over the last day or two having to do with Zelensky, because when he considers Zelensky not credible, he's supposed to be making a deal with him, whether you like him or you don't like him. So I certainly wouldn't want to put secondary tariffs on Russia, but if they were put on, it would not be very good.
President Trump speaking there. Well, EU leaders have also become increasingly frustrated with President Putin's negotiating tactics. Speaking today, Europe's top diplomat, Kaja Kallas, urged Russia to show goodwill and agree to a peace deal with Ukraine.
What we need is also Russia to agree to this ceasefire, to move on, to show goodwill by, giving back the Ukrainian children that have been deported to Russia or releasing the prisoners of war. Many things that they can show. So I think U.S. also has the role to put more pressure on Russia to stop this war.
Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Alessandro Minuto-Rizzo, who is the former acting Secretary General and also Deputy Secretary General of NATO. Ambassador, you served as Ambassador of Italy to the Western European Union and to the Committee for Policy and Security of the European Union. It's great to have you with us from Rome. There's loads we can talk about. I just want to start by saying, just looking at the world order as things stand right now. Some are saying that the collective West faces a double wake-up call. We've got an expansionist, aggressive Russia on the one hand and an increasingly isolationist-looking United States on the other. Is that how you see things? And what's being done about this new reality?
Well, you were right in your introduction. It's, of course, you simplify things for the others. I understand that. Well, there is one thing I would like to add, because this is clear that we are in a situation which is new, totally new for us. And so you have public opinion very disoriented and many worries all around the world. On the other hand, the new American administration, I think, which is at the source of all this uncertainty, is really new, really new. They came in only on January 20, What do I mean? I mean that, perhaps we can have a certain reservation about really a total change, because these people are completely new, except perhaps the Secretary of State, which is a senator, a person who knows the world, but the others are really people who have never been outside the United States, first. Second, I don't think that they know each other well, because the recent episode that I'm sure you have followed concerning sending delicate, sensitive information by mistake to a journalist shows that there is something there which has to be adjusted. So my hope, of course, it's a hope of everybody, but I hope of many people, is that maybe these people will adjust a little bit to realities and become a little bit more the kind of Americans we knew in the past. right? You know what I mean.
Sure.
Uh,
And let me
because
just, can I just pick up on that? Because, I mean, you're talking about a brand new administration here. And I think there was some evidence of that, for example, in the latest negotiations on the war in Ukraine, where on the one hand, you had these seasoned Russian diplomats who've been there in some cases for 2+ decades in the same job. And on the other side of the table, you had this brand new team, which you just described for us there. I mean, there is, isn't there, a bit of a mismatch in terms of the skill sets on the two sides?
There is a mismatch. I'm sure there is a mismatch. I'm only trying to see, you know, the glass half full, if you like. You know, I'm always trying to look in a positive position because, you know, experience shows that crises arise because human beings are like that and nations are like that. But, you know, sometimes out of a crisis you have a good outcome sometime. So we hope this is the case. For me, as a European, the most important thing is this disconnection, apparent disconnection, recently shown between the United States of America and Europe, you know, because we thought, and we still think, in fact, even today, we hope, that we are it was called the Euro-Atlantic community only a few years ago. And then to think that now some Americans think that regulations existing in Europe are against liberty and freedom, that of course is a shock for us. So that's why I say, I hope that, you know, these people who are new, perhaps adjust a little bit to reality. Allow me to say one thing, if I can. When President Obama came to the Oval Office, he said this famous sentence, you know, the phrase, pivot to Asia, you remember that. But then, of course, he changed his mind in the 8 years of his term. And in the end, he found out that the real friends and allies were the Europeans. And his last visits were to Germany, to Chancellor Merkel, to Paris, to London, to Rome. So, you know, I think that we still have a glimmer of hope that this change in America is not so abrupt as it looks. In fact, it looks at this moment.
Sure. I mean, one of the things we learned from that unfortunate leaked exchange between those senior officials in America was that one or two of them regard Europe as, quote, pathetic. Others would say Europe are freeloaders, suggesting they're not doing enough, they're not pulling their weight. And yet, you know, as we're saying here, you know, Europe collectively has quite considerable experience. Lots of countries within Europe, each with seasoned diplomats and leaders. How do those leaders make themselves heard by this administration in Washington? Because clearly how they approach them and what sort of language they use when approaching them will determine whether or not they're listened to. How would you advise them to proceed?
You mean difference among European countries and governments?
I'm saying, how do we get the new administration in the United States to listen to the European leaders who've got this rich experience? Because if they don't approach the Trump administration in the right way, they're going to be disregarded.
Well, you know, in Europe, there are, let's say, simplify things, two ways of looking at that. The majority is thinking that we are facing a totally new America. And we have to, I use this sentence, perhaps not the right one, to defend ourselves in the sense of, you know, creating what is called European strategic autonomy, you know, not against the United States, but to have Europe being autonomous in the world, in this difficult world. There are other countries, including, I think, my country in this moment, Italy, where the government thinks that perhaps it is possible to build some kind of bridge with the Americans and, you know, to convince them that in the end, it is not so true. And I think this is good. It's a good idea. It's not so true that Europeans are parasites. They are taking advantage of America. Because if you look at things, and I think it's important to say this to the people who are not specialists, you know, it is true that you have a commercial advantage, a small one, for European. We export more than we import from the United States. But it's a limited thing. And if you look at the capitals, you know, there are more European capital going to the United States than vice versa. the savings, our savings, to a large part go to Wall Street and go to America, to the stock exchange. So this is a big, huge advantage for the American. And if you speak about politics, when 9/11 took place, it is some time ago, but not 1 century ago, European squares were full of people supporting the United States. The Americans should remember that Article 5 of NATO, this famous Article 5 Common Defense, was invoked only once in history when the two towers were attacked by terrorists, supporting the United States. And in Afghanistan, it is a case that I know well because I started the NATO operation in Afghanistan. About 40% of the troops there were from European countries, and 35 to 40% of casualties were European. So, it's not really true that Europeans are free riders, as it is said too quickly by people who are perhaps ignorant.
Ambassador, you raised lots of important points, and I'd like to come back to Giorgia Meloni, your Prime Minister, in a little while, because I'd love to get your insights on how she's approaching these various geopolitical challenges. But before that, we're leading with the story today that President Trump is very angry with President Putin. In fact, there was some vulgar language used to describe how he feels about President Putin at this particular moment. What's your understanding of why President Trump is so angry all of a sudden?
This is a very good question. We all would like to know more about that. It is not an easy thing to do. What we can get, if you look at in a professional way of things, you see a certain sympathy of the President of the United States towards Vladimir Putin. It is not a secret. He's, saying that openly. But perhaps there is a simplistic view there. I suspect that President Trump is thinking too much, if you allow me to say in American terms, which is not a bad thing to say this, that, in fact, that, that you have an argument, you can convince your interlocutor, that you are right and it is wrong or vice versa, and you can reach a deal. The Russian system doesn't work in that way. The Russian system is an old work, is a very sophisticated diplomacy in its own way, I don't like it, but it is like that. And so I think that what in fact is happening today, and your question is the central question, is more that Putin using President Trump rather than President Trump using Putin. So this is only the beginning of the story, because yesterday, as you said, President Trump said for the first time that he's angry with the Russian president. So maybe a sentence en passant like that, maybe it will be changed. But certainly is a sign that the authority that he thought at the beginning he would have is not working, And in fact, the Russians are bombing Ukraine day and night. In Saudi Arabia, close to where you are speaking from, there were two apparent ceasefires on energy and on the Black Sea, and they are not working. They have not started yet. So we are just at the beginning of the story. The good news, if you like, is that when you start a peace process, history shows that sooner or later the objective is reached. If you think, for instance, Vietnam, it was many years ago, but Kissinger, he started in Paris to start to discuss with the North Vietnamese. They were discussing the size of the table, small details, but then in the end, the solution was fine. So, I still hope that is going to happen. Of course, that if you allow me to conclude this, there are two stumbling blocks which are very important. One is land territory. Is Ukraine really obliged to give up a part of its territory? And what about its status? Has it to become a neutral country or what?
Indeed. And just going back to this anger of President Trump, this is a new tactic, and we haven't heard President Trump using this kind of language about his Russian opposite number before. But despite this shift in rhetoric, and then we'll come on to Ukraine and the details of where we're headed with negotiations, until now, a lot of people in Europe were very concerned that there was this perception that President Trump was very easy on President Putin, perhaps too easy. What do you say to that? Do you share that concern?
Well, there is one other thing to add to that, From a Russian point of view, well, first of all, let's start from the beginning. The Russian Federation is not the Soviet Union. So it is less powerful and it has less capacity and capability than the Soviet Union. Sometimes we are confusing the two things. Russia is not the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was one country and it became 15 countries. So there's a little bit. Second thing, which is very important, I think, in the Russian mentality, as far as I can, by experience, know about that, is that the Russians recognize only America as being their equal. So from a certain point of view, it's very good, in the interest of peace, that the Americans say to the Russians, yes, you are a great country, you are very important, we have really to reach a deal. Because from a European point of view, the European Union looks, commercial thing, small country, not at the same level. They don't like NATO, but they respect NATO. On the other hand, they don't seem to respect very much the European Union, because if we follow what is happening apparently, is that Russia is opposed to Ukraine joining NATO, and I think it will never join NATO, in fact, as a matter of fact. But on the other hand, it seems that joining the European Union is all right. So, this is really something completely new.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, isn't it, that NATO should be dictated to in this way by the very force that it was established to protect itself and other countries from, i.e. Russia. And Russia is saying who can and can't be a member of NATO. And it looks and sounds like the United States is saying, actually, yeah, Russia's right. We won't let let Ukraine join NATO. I mean, that's what America's saying, isn't it?
Well, there are, we are not reasoning in rational terms, because if I have understood one thing is that human beings are not directed by rationality, because one of the arguments which is used very often by Russia is that NATO is an aggressive organization, arriving, coming very close to the Russian border. It is true in the sense that many countries belonging to the Soviet bloc have joined NATO. That's correct. But this doesn't mean that it is aggressive. I think that we have to keep in mind one thing, which is very often forgotten. The Soviet Union, Comecon, the Warsaw Pact, were as they were because in May 1945, when the Second World War ended, that's where the Soviet army arrived. So they were under the occupation of the Soviet Union. After perestroika, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, those countries became, let's put it, free again, independent. They were not subject to any pressure or occupation by and then, of course, those countries, and we know that it's very open, they wanted to join Europe and NATO. And why not, And there is no historical reason for Russia to be afraid of that. The Polish, the Hungarians, the Czechs, the Romanians made their choice in a very clear way, but not in an aggressive way towards Russia, I don't know if I can say something more on that.
Sure, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, there is one agreement which is called NATO-Russia Founding Act that you can read yourself very easily. It is on internet, May 1997. It shows very well the situation, to my mind. Why? Because negotiations were already underway between Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia to join NATO. So there was no issue that the Russians did not know. They knew exactly that they were going in the same direction. But they agreed on that. And on the side of NATO, in order to dispel worries by Russia of being aggressed, there was the provision expressed in very clear terms that weapons of mass destruction would not be put on the territory of those new members. No nuclear arms, nothing of this kind, and it is very clearly written. And even from the point of view of conventional forces, if you like, it was expressed the concept that the old countries of NATO would put only symbolic troops in the new accessing countries. It means a battalion, 500 men, something like that. So, it was not really something that the Russians could not understand, And in the beginning, they accepted that. Because, the Russians, they were in Bosnia after all, not really with NATO, but close to NATO, in Kosovo as well. And it's only in 2005, 2006, 2007, 2008, that President Putin decided that he had to react and to go back to a presumed imperial past of Russia.
Okay, but just moving back to the present day and these efforts to engage with Russia by this brand new Trump administration, only in office for scarcely 3 months. What do you think of the US effort so far? I mean, do you think the United States is right to be trying to engage with Russia and end the war in Ukraine? Are they going about it in the right way? And how do you rate Mr. Trump's deal-broking tactics?
Well, first of all, I would like to say this, that I think that President Putin decided to start the special military operation, I say aggression of Ukraine, on a wrong assumption. And this happens in international affairs. I don't want to say something special, but if you think, for instance, when Iraq was invaded, you use the word that you like, by the Americans, President Bush was convinced that the Marines would be greeted with flowers, and he was genuinely convinced of that. The reality was different, as we know, but this is another story. I think, personally, that President Putin thought he was convinced, probably by some advisors and some Ukrainians of, let's say, Russian tendency, that to occupy Kiev and to change government in Kiev would be very easy, that he would be there in 3 days. And he acted on the wrong assumption. And we know the reality, this tragedy, going on since 3 years. And of course, it has become very difficult to stop it, as we said in the beginning of our conversation, because sentiments are very, very harsh, very harsh. The Ukrainian people, as far as we know, they are really tired and sick because they are poor, they are inferior in numbers, and I think they would be happy to end the war. The only thing is that they have to end it in a reasonable way, an honorable way. And this is really, I think, where things become difficult, because the Russians think in a totally different way.
Yeah, and I mean,
different kind.
And we've got this sticking point at the moment, and one of Russia's red lines appears to be the issue of peacekeeping forces, some sort of security guarantee in Ukraine to defend the country post-war agreement. But quite interesting, your Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, said, if Russia does not plan to invade its neighbours again, it is unclear why it should not accept security guarantees. She's got a point, hasn't she?
Well, if you're speaking about I understand what you're talking about. This issue, about Ukraine joining NATO or not.
No, it's not about NATO. It's about having peacekeeping forces that could be from a neutral country, could be from a European country. One of the issues is having this so-called security guarantee for Ukraine.
It is a very difficult point. Very difficult point. It's not very clear, frankly. Because what Prime Minister Meloni says, she says Ukraine should not join NATO, but Ukraine should be given Article 5 guarantees of NATO, which is, a little bit difficult to achieve, I think. On this, let's say, coalition of the willing, were promoted by the UK and France, is not, to me, clear what their purpose is, I think the coalition of the willing should take place after an agreement is reached, or when agreement is near. But to send the European troops, this is a personal opinion, of course, to send the European troops to Ukraine, what does it mean, Is only considered to be a hostile gesture by the Russians. Is it going to help really the Ukrainians? I don't think so. It's not a game changer, you know. I understand the reasons behind that. You want to tell the Ukrainians that in the future their statehood will be guaranteed by the Europeans, but I think that we have not to precipitate things. And it is good that things are prepared, but to send European troops in this moment in Ukraine, I don't think it would add to the solution of the crisis.
I'd just like to ask you a few more questions about Giorgia Meloni, because she's a figure that we see increasingly on the world stage. And I just wonder whether you think she's doing a good job of being an interface between Europe and this new Trump administration, because she seems to be walking the tightrope quite skillfully, doesn't she?
Well, you know, Giorgia Meloni, I think, you know, that she invested a lot on Atlanticism, on, you know, a very strong link of Italy and Europe with the United States. And it worked very well with President Biden, you know. Now, of course, having Trump coming in, you know, and this new, we spoke about that a few minutes ago, this new generation of leaders whom we don't know much about, puts her in a difficult situation, because she would like, I think, I don't know because I'm not close to her, but I think she would like to convince the Americans that the Europeans are not as bad as they think, and that the deal should be an easier deal than what it is in mind. Is it going to work? I don't know. I don't know, because those new tariff duties will be imposed on April 2, if I remember correctly, and still the Europeans don't know exactly how to react, because of course we know that from history that imposing duties does not solve problems. You can do it in exceptional cases, but not as normality, you know. You can disrupt international trade, and that would be damaging the entire world, even the countries where you're speaking from, you know, in this conversation. So President Trump seems to be convinced, on the contrary, that tariff duties will solve American problem. I think that in his mind, he thinks the European and Japanese, etc., friend would move to the United States, but it's not as simple as that. So this is, I think, is going to be really the issue of tomorrow. In a way, even more than Ukraine, because Ukraine, in a way or in another, I don't want to simplify things at all, you know, but I think in the end, something will be achieved, you know. You can control the issue, because after all, it is there. It's very bad for the Ukrainians and for the Russians, of course, but it's there. When you speak about tariff duties and international trade and this flow of capitals, then you are discussing about the world. And about the world, you see now, this is a fragmented world. It is a no one's world, as one book said, you know. And we need a lot of wisdom, which is not apparently there very much.
Okay, Ambassador, we don't have very long left, but I wanted to ask you about Greenland. Obviously very much in the headlines the last, well, couple of months, really. NATO, if I've understood correctly, falls under the NATO umbrella by virtue of the fact that it is a sovereign territory that is controlled by Denmark. What happens, though, if the United States takes Greenland by force?
It's a good case. We are speaking about things which, you know, only 2 or 3 months ago seemed very, perhaps the object of a novel. I don't know. I think, and okay, you know, what I think is that perhaps from a part of the American administration, there is not much knowledge about the rest of the world. You have seen last week, the deputy, the vice president and his wife, they went to Greenland, and they thought probably in good faith that it was an easy walk. And then they found out that, you know, if they go to the American base, perfect, it's all right, it's legal, it's no problem. But if you go into Greenland and you tell them, you know, you have to become Americans, then the people say, you know, but what are you, no, why? Why should we become American? So there we are. I don't think that the problem ends here. It will be certainly something very serious, and I don't know the outcome of that, because this is difficult to imagine. perhaps there could be some kind of negotiation where you have more American bases in Greenland, but not sovereignty. I don't know. Certainly, it is a very painful issue. It was better not to raise it, I think.
I'd just like to ask you, Ambassador, what sort of a message you think it would send the rest of the world were the Trump administration to seize Greenland and take it by force? And do you think Canada might be next?
On the media, we can speak about everything, but to me, the use of force on Greenland would seem something completely unreasonable and unjustified, unseen, unprecedented, Let's be serious, How can, the United States use force to take Greenland from a democratic country like Denmark with an autonomous region where they voted only 2 weeks ago, and they seem very reasonable, ready to be allied with the United States, perhaps to give more influence to them, but not to become a part of the territory of the United States. So I hope it will never happen, and certainly the rest of the world, I think most of the world would not agree with such a position if it would ever be taken. But then, you have also another point, which we have to take into account in this conversation, is that the President of the United States is making a press conference every day. So he has to say something. And I don't know how much of that has to be taken seriously, as we should probably, or just, something that you say for the media or something that you feel that you will not do. This is very difficult to ascertain at this point in time. We'll need more time. And then there is another point that we're not really taking into account in this kind of discussions, is that we spoke about the international scene very rightly. You asked me the first question was about, the globe, how the world is looking, what is global security. That we don't know how the American people would react to this new kind of attitude, because what is happening now is not really at this point very serious, but capitals, I understand, are going away to Switzerland and other places from the United States. So is public opinion in the United States going to like this in the long term? I don't know. This is really, I think, that will be the decisive factor in the end.
Indeed, and this is my last question. I mean, I wonder how the American people will feel if their country is no longer perceived as being a reliable ally to old friends, NATO countries, European countries, Western nations. And is, in your opinion, the United States still a reliable ally?
I think that the Europeans, I think 99%, they would remain good allies of the United States. And they would like that things remain as they were up to a month ago. This is a general opinion, I think, in Europe, with large majority. Then, I really hope that NATO remains. Why do I say that? With some experience, if you like. Because the Americans are at ease in NATO, because they are part of NATO. They are there, there are international staff. The Supreme Allied Commander of Europe is an American general. They have an influence there. Not absolute power, as somebody said, no, but certainly they have an influence which is more important than the other. This is, I have to accept that, But they feel at home. So you can discuss with them in that context, as being part of the same family, if you can use this term, the same group of people, like-minded people, same values, more or less, same interests, more or less. So now, from what I see, the president is not saying anymore that he would like to leave NATO. So, for the moment, this is something which is staying there. In the past, and I remember I have been there several times, in the past, NATO was very popular in the United States. All polls that I remember in the last 20 years or so show that the majority of Americans, 70 to 75% of Americans, appreciate NATO and are favorable to that. I'm not sure they understand exactly what it is, but the general idea is acceptable to them. And so to say that now the NATO allies are free riders and parasites, I'm not sure it goes down well to the majority of American people, I think.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time, but I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Ambassador Alessandro Minuto-Rizzo, thank you very much indeed for your time today.
Thank you for your questions. You know, we live in an important moment, you know, and it's very important, I think, to have a wise attitude. You know, not to be taken too much by emotions, you know. This is very important.
There's plenty to talk about, and we could have talked a lot longer, but thank you very much again, Ambassador. Thank you.
Thank you to you.
We'll be continuing to talk about the latest efforts to broker a ceasefire deal in Ukraine right after this short break. Welcome back. Now, let's get a US perspective on President Donald Trump's latest comments with regards to the ceasefire process. To help us decode them, we can speak to Greg Swenson, the chair of Republicans Overseas, who joins us now from London. Greg, always a pleasure to have you with us. President Trump saying he's angry with President Putin. Why do you think he's so angry all of a sudden?
Yeah, I think he's rather annoyed. I'm not sure it's all of a sudden, but it's clearly because Putin is not responding the way that Trump and the administration would like him to. But look, I think it's clear that, you know, he has to pressure Putin just like he was pressuring Zelensky. I don't think that's new. I think that this is just the start of that change. And, you know, his threats, you know, economic threats are showing that, you know, any of this talk about switching sides or you know, supporting or favoring Putin, you know, was just exaggerated and premature, to say the least. I think it was productive to get Putin to the table. Now that that's happened, I think you've got to see some better behavior, and Trump will not be afraid to use economic force to force Putin to negotiate.
Yeah, we're going to talk about some of the levers that President Trump has at his disposal. But just to summarize that first point, I mean, it's sort of an overall sense of frustration with the pace of progress and perhaps not quite enough to show for all the efforts. Is that how you'd sort of sum it up?
Yeah, I think that's safe to say, Tom. You know, he was frustrated with Zelensky when he was dragging his feet, and now frustrated with Putin for dragging this process out. And so I understand the president's frustration as well as the other negotiators. So, you know, look, this thing is not meant to be linear. This is going to be a difficult process. You know, shuttle diplomacy always is.
One of the things that Russia said and President Putin has touted in the last day or two, that maybe one of the things that's particularly irritated President Trump is this idea of a UN interim government in Ukraine while elections are being held. I mean, the idea of sidelining President Zelensky, I mean, is that out of the question as far as the US is concerned, do you think?
I would think so. I mean, I can't say with 100% confidence, Tom, but look, I think Zelensky has cooperated, you know, with a couple of bumps in the road, a few speed bumps, notably in the Oval Office, but for the most part, he has cooperated. And I do think that there is a limit, and maybe I wouldn't call it a line in the sand, but there is a limit ultimately about what the Ukrainians will concede to.
I mean, we've spoken to quite a lot of people from the Trump administration and people who are very much in President Trump's orbit. And they've said things to us on this channel, like President Zelensky is not a legitimate leader of Ukraine, that he's corrupt, and that he's been blocking elections, he's banned the opposition, and therefore he's not a legitimate leader. I mean, it doesn't sound all that different from what President Putin was saying. And I'm wondering why you think, therefore, all of a sudden, you know, President Trump's decided he doesn't like hearing that narrative.
Yeah, well, look, I think some of the supporters of this new methodology might make those arguments, and there is some merit to those. It doesn't mean that it's productive to say them, but I just think it's funny that, you know, many in the media in America have really freaked out about, you know, President Trump calling him a dictator. I don't think that was particularly consistent with what his quite complimentary diplomacy with Zelensky, but he does occasionally use words, and I think some of his supporters use those words. But it's funny, they called Trump a dictator and a fascist and a Nazi for 9 months during the campaign, and then everybody gets all sensitive when people throw some words around. So look, I don't think it's that serious. I think in many respects they're just trying to counter the arguments in the West that are just so overwhelmingly supportive of Zelensky in rhetoric, but then there's no action. I've never seen any notable support for actually working with Ukraine with boots on the ground. And so I do think there has to be some limits to that conversation. I think they were just perhaps pushing back on this euphoria about the great Zelensky running around, looking for support, and just dialing it down a little bit. So I think this is just classic negotiating, and a bit of political rhetoric isn't going to hurt anybody.
Some of President Trump's anger appears to be reserved for the Ukrainian leader, nevertheless, in particular with relation to the minerals deal. President Trump seemed to be saying, don't even think about trying to renegotiate that deal. I mean, do you think the deal is a fair one?
I do. I do think it's fair, because the more you have the U.S. involved, the more there's, an implied security umbrella there, even if it's not, written in stone. And I think also, the economic development or redevelopment of Ukraine is going to be really critical. It's not just what the U.S. gets out of it, it's what Ukraine gets out of it, which is management, skill, as well as capital coming into their country, which they desperately need. So I think that's a win-win. And, the basically, you might say differently for oil and gas, which has a shorter cycle, but with critical minerals, that's a 10-year cycle. There'll be no actual critical minerals processed for years to come. So it's going to take patient capital, which the U.S. has. It's going to take a lot of patience, but there has to be some shared upside for both countries.
And you were talking about some of the levers that President Trump has at his disposal a little earlier on. We alluded to them. And, there was this sense of alarm in Europe in particular that perhaps President Trump was, making too many concessions to the Russians and not getting any in return. I mean, at this stage, what would you say President Trump's strongest levers are with regards to getting the Russians to agree to something?
Yeah, great question. It is absolutely economic or geoeconomics for the most part. I mean, if President Trump wants to put the squeeze on Putin and the Russian economy, it will be debilitating for the Russians and to Putin. And so, look, I know there were sanctions put on Russia after February of 2022. They really didn't move the needle that much. The EU purchased $22 billion of oil, gas, and coal from Russia, not in 2021, Tom, but last year, while contributing $18 billion to supporting Ukraine. They're essentially funding both sides of this stalemate. So I don't think that's sustainable. I think real sanctions on Russia, like an embargo kind of regime, the same that was put on Iran back in Trump's first term, which really debilitated Iran. Now, I know that's apples and oranges, but still, Russia is really dependent on Europe for shipping oil, gas, and coal. They're dependent on the market for oil. And if that was actually constrained, this would be much more meaningful than anything that was done in the first term.
Well, obviously, President Putin will be hoping he can use the relationship he has with President Trump to avoid that situation. Yeah. And President Trump is hoping he can use his relationship with President Putin to bring about some sort of a ceasefire deal and a conclusion to this 3-year-long war in Ukraine. But I mean, what is the nature of their relationship? I mean, do you think it would be an exaggeration to describe them as being friends?
Yeah, I think that would be a bit of an exaggeration. I mean, Trump prides himself on having relationships with his adversaries. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. But remember, in his first term, he was the first American president to call out Putin for killing his own people in 1999 with the fake bombings in Moscow that helped him win the election. So, a series of American presidents, the CIA, as well as the White House, Clinton, Bush, Obama, all knew about Putin and what he had done. And Trump wasn't afraid to call him out. He sent Javelin missiles to Ukraine. He put sanctions on Nord Stream 2. He's not afraid to use military support and economic sanctions against his adversaries. And he did it clearly with Putin in the first term. So, that's all sitting there waiting to be done again. And I think that proves that, this, again, all this talk about Trump, favoring Putin, it was just greatly exaggerated if you look at what he did in his first term.
Just before we crossed you, we were speaking to the former Deputy Secretary General of NATO, Alessandro Minuto-Rizzo, who was, I believe, in that position in the early 2000s. He seemed to be suggesting that, on the one side of the negotiating table, you've got these seasoned Russian diplomats who in some cases have been there for 2+ decades in those same positions, and you've got this brand new administration on the other side of the table, with the exception of perhaps Marco Rubio, who hasn't really done very much outside the United States on sort of the international stage. Do you agree that there is a bit of a mismatch in terms of levels of experience and skill sets?
Yeah, I think there's a mismatch there for sure. And I would bet on the American team 100 times over the Russians. I mean, just because they're old, probably dating back to the Soviet days doesn't make them better. Look, this administration, everyone's really unified. You saw that even in the leaked signal messages from last week. Everyone's on the same page. They have debates, they talk, but I would put a lot of faith in Marco Rubio and the rest of the team. And remember that, that even though the Russian diplomats might have been around for a while, the country's isolated. They should not be feared. They should be marginalized. If anything, we can do that economically for sure. And I think the one other point that people overlook, Tom, is that 18 months ago, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States, Mark Milley, who not exactly a Trump supporter or fan, he went to Biden and said, this is the time to settle this thing. This is a stalemate. The Ukrainians were very brave to fend off the invasion of Kyiv. Good for them, great for them. But it's time to settle this because it's a stalemate and Ukraine cannot win. His counterpart in Ukraine said the same thing to his president, to Zelensky. Both Zelensky and Biden ignored the advice. In fact, Zelensky fired his chief military leader, and Milley was just ignored. So, this is time to end this stalemate. I think that's what President Trump is trying to do.
And just to wrap up, Greg, and sort of to go back to where we started, I mean, do you think there is a sort of general realization in the Trump administration that this is indeed a highly complex situation, and perhaps it was wishful thinking / naive to think it could be resolved quickly, let alone over the telephone in a quick conversation?
Yeah, no, I think wishful thinking for sure, but I think that's okay. They went in with a very optimistic attitude, just bringing a different angle, a different flavor to the stalemate and trying to end it. I think there's, a lot of merit in attempts, even if they fail, because, more body bags, I don't think anybody wants that. So, this is a moment where I think, he'll lead with economic threats. The winner of economic rivalry ultimately is the winner of strategic rivalry. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. The U.S. will do the right thing here. And at some point soon, I hope we see at least a ceasefire, or a real ceasefire, as well as a settlement long term. Okay,
Greg Swenson, Chair of Republicans Overseas. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us.
Thanks, Tom.
From London. In other news, the French far-right leader Marine Le Pen has been banned from running for the French presidency in 2027 and sentenced to 4 years in prison. This after being convicted, along with 24 other party members, of embezzling European parliamentary funds. Well, Le Pen will also be required to pay a €100,000 fine. Well, observers say she is almost certain to appeal. Well, the French politician has consistently described this case as a political attack, claiming that the judge sought to, quote, bring about her political death. Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Benedicte Paviot, who is the UK correspondent for France 24, who joins us now from London. Benedicte, thank you very much indeed for joining us. I mean, fair to say this is a catastrophic setback for Le Pen and her party. This 5-year ban from public office means that unless she successfully appeals, she can't run for the presidency in 2027, can she?
This is indeed a very significant blow, a real setback, not a completely unpredicted one, but a very harsh verdict, really, for Marine Le Pen, handed out today by the French judge. She has been barred from running for public office, as you say, for 5 years, meaning she will not be able to run in the 2027 French presidential election which, according to the polls, she could win. She's been found guilty of something very serious. She's been found guilty of embezzling European funds to finance her French far-right National Rally party. And it looks as if Le Pen expected really the guilty sentence, but she didn't expect, I think, the 5 years not being banned from running for public office. And she stormed out in a rage. She's absolutely incandescent with rage, and her lawyer, although we haven't heard from the dame herself publicly yet, she's going to speak, I think, for the first time since the verdict. We won't hear from her till this evening on French national television, and her lawyer has already confirmed that she's going to appeal these sentences. He says that she is combative and that she will tell us what is on her mind herself.
Okay, so she's not going to be able to run for office, it looks like, in 2027 unless her appeal is successful. She was given 2 years in prison, 2 more years as a suspended sentence. I mean, is she likely, do you think, to see the inside of a prison cell, Benedicte?
She's also been given a €100,000 fine, amende, as they're called in French, some £83,000. That's quite big as well. Well, she has to wear this electronic tag, and a French journalist colleague apparently was told by her some time ago that if, in the unlikely, she thought, event that she would be condemned to this, that she would not be wearing an electronic tag, and that she would be prepared to say, well, okay, let's see if you dare to take me to prison. So we'll see if that is indeed still her thinking today. This is, the judgment's just been handed out, and I think nobody thought it would be, well, not nobody, but she clearly didn't think it would be this harsh. She is now busy in a crisis meeting with the president of the party, Jordan Bardella, which we can come on to talk about, strategizing, clearly preparing what she's going to say tonight. This is a very tough person who comes from a very political family. Indeed, her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, was the founder of what was the Front National, the predecessor to this National Rally Party. And I think we'll get an initial flavor and idea of her strategy tonight when she does speak at 8 p.m. Paris time on French national television. I'm sure she'll have a lot to say. Maybe when things are a little bit calmer, she may be even more detailed about what she's thinking. But is she prepared to try and, go all the way to prison? We don't know what the reaction of people with petitions or her partisans will be. We will see. This is just the beginning of the consequences. But she could really shake up now because of this French politics. She could decide that her party in parliament, for example, tries to join the Left Party in a confidence vote in this François Bayrou government. So I think we're in for some significant days ahead on the political scene.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a really turbulent sort of 12 months for French politics, hasn't it? And this is just the latest setback for the system, the latest test for the system, I should say. I mean, 2027 was going to be Le Pen's 4th and final attempt at winning the French presidency. And now it seems like there's going to be quite a lot of people drawing parallels between Marine Le Pen's legal woes and those of President Donald Trump, who managed, despite those setbacks, to win the presidency for the second time. I mean, is that a parallel a lot of people are drawing, do you think?
Not a lot, but I think you're absolutely wise to be drawing that parallel already, because I think that she will immediately say that this is a political witch hunt. That is what her closest collaborators and advisors are already saying. They have already been talking to the French media. I'm sure they'll be talking to the international media very quickly as well. They will be saying that although this, let's be clear, was a judicial decision, an independent judicial decision. They are saying the system, the political system in France, they're accusing it of being really stacked against them. And of course, as I was alluding to the polls, she is, nobody's ever guaranteed of winning, but that she looked like being the really front contender for the 2027 presidential election. Let's remember that President Macron is in his second mandate. He can't be a candidate again. She really thought she had a very good chance, but then she has thought so before of winning. And a lot can happen in politics and in world events, as we well know. It used to be said in British politics that a week was a long time. Now sometimes it takes even less than that. But the fact is that the National Rally will have to be strategizing as right now for a plan B, and that plan B is very much with its current president, a certain Jordan Bardella, who's only 29 years old, about to turn 30. And she let it be known almost a little bit reluctantly, she is very clearly his mentor, a few days ago, that she thought that he had the capacity one day to become president of the Republic. So what is she going to announce tonight? What will be her strategy as far as her condemnations? What will be the basis for a legal appeal or an attempt at an appeal, and to try and get rid of that conviction, which is almost not got rid of at all, if that's a word. It's a very, very narrow path, and it's very difficult to predict how this is going to play out. But no doubt she will be claiming that yes, there should be a petition. Other politicians, it has to be said, were worried, even big sort of political opponents of hers, that this could be a problem in the sense of French democracy. But it's funny how politicians, before they're in office and even when they become MPs, think it's a very good idea of coming down hard on corruption of any MP, member of parliament, etc., or political leader, and then when in office don't think that's such a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, as we've been talking, reactions been coming in from different parts of the political spectrum. We've heard Nigel Farage in the United Kingdom, where you are, saying Marine Le Pen has been cancelled, he says, on what he described as, quote, very trumped up charges. Perhaps he's drawing a parallel there with President Trump. We've also, we've been talking about Jordan Bardella, the 29-year-old who may have to now take the reins of the National Rally Party. And he said today it's not only Marine Le Pen who's been unjustly condemned, it was French democracy that was killed. So he's gone
executed.
Exactly, a little bit further in his assessment. But, let's talk about Jordan Bardella, 29 years old. I mean, has he got what it takes as such a young man to carry the mantle?
Well, Marine Le Pen has privately expressed that she thinks that he does. Clearly, her ambitions, I'm tempted to say, even now, are that she should be the one. Her party was very much looking at a scenario of her being elected, she would like and hoped, in 2027 as president of the French Republic. The mandates are now 5 years long, un quinquennat, and to have Jordan Bardella as her prime minister. But if she is not able to hold public office, then, will she 100% back Jordan Bardella as being the presidential candidate for 2027? A lot can happen in the next weeks and months. What of a possible very narrow chance of an appeal, of her somehow managing just a few months before to actually stand as to be that presidential candidate? Let's remember that there are 2 rounds in French presidential elections. A lot of ifs, a lot of questions. Not everybody in her party believes that Jordan Bardella is the right person. And yet, according to polls again, and some of the latest polls I was looking at just an hour ago, he is actually more popular to stand as a presidential candidate than she is. She has come with a lot of baggage, and although she has managed to detoxify the party again, she has some very, very strong opponents, both in French Parliament and also in the French population.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, the Le Pen name and the Le Pen brand is sort of, as you say, it is still toxic in the minds of a lot of people. And we should add that Jean-Marie Le Pen, who founded the party that she's been running, died only a couple of months ago. So what you're saying is, Bardella is doing well in the polls. Some would say even better than Le Pen, according to some polls. I know there isn't another presidential election until 2027, but were there to be a presidential election tomorrow, I mean, would he, would his party and would the National Rally win it, do you think?
Well, as a well-trained journalist, obviously, there will not be a presidential election tomorrow. It is set for 2027. That is what could happen is something different, equally dramatic. And that is that if there was a dissolution of French Parliament, then according to today's verdict, Marine Le Pen would not be able to stand as an MP anymore. So there are some really very grave, serious consequences for this party and for this embezzlement of EU funds. Obviously, the EU Parliament is very satisfied, as is the state prosecutor. These verdicts have been handed out. She's not alone, having been singled out. Obviously, her banning of public office is the most prominent, is the most serious, and it will be very interesting to see how this party translates this into a public appeal to the population, having lost quite a few of her collaborators, how they manage this internally. Marine Le Pen has been so consumed by attending trial up until November that she didn't manage her party as carefully as she would normally have done. So let's see. Apparently she's very combative. That's not a surprise. She is very, very disappointed and angry at this verdict. And let's see how other politicians in France as well react. And if, for example, there was a call for demonstrations for her partisans, what will happen with a crisis of maybe a vote of confidence in this current François Bayrou government. So there's a lot that could play out, that will play out, no doubt. Where the sort of dominoes fall will then influence the rest. And this is sometimes, it's events, dear boy, is one of the British expressions in British politics. It will be, who knows who's going to be actually the candidates in 2027? Who knows what world events, as they are changing so significantly, will it be somebody with a strong economic background or not? Clearly, Marine Le Pen wants her party to be front and center of that presidential debate. She would like to lead that candidacy, but will we see a Bardella candidacy? Those are some of the questions we ask ourselves today in 2025. What will happen 2 years down the line? We'll be reporting on that, no doubt.
I look forward to speaking to you about that. But before then, just one final question to you, Benedicte. Just listening to, to sort of wrap up the conversation and just listening to a lot of what you've been saying, how would you explain, to what would you attribute the enduring popularity of Le Pen, or maybe now Bardella's National Rally Party? What is it that's made it resonate with its messaging and the French public?
Appealing to those who feel they are the forgotten, appealing to those who are unemployed and who feel that there is an elite ruling the government, ruling the country, that despite holding down a job, they can't afford, sometimes two jobs, they can't afford to pay their everyday bills, gas, water, electricity, etc. That she has done very successfully of people from all kinds of walks of life and social backgrounds. It's not just the working class. Globalization has been a very big thing, putting France first with jobs, with all kinds of issues of identity. Those are the things that she has managed successfully to appeal to the French people, which has explained its success at the European elections and indeed at the last, let's say, limited success ultimately, as they are not part of the French government. And she will continue to say, I am the one, a bit as you were alluding to President Trump before, I'm the outsider. I'm the one who really represents you. We can change things. We will put you first. That is what she has successfully managed to do, unlike her father, the founder of the predecessor of the National Party, Jean-Marie Le Pen, who, as you said, died recently. What a year Marine Le Pen is having.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Always a pleasure. Benedicte Paviot, UK correspondent for France 24. Thank you very much indeed. Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.